There were 6 symbols carved into the bar's underside, 6 marks that shouldn't have existed. Alan traced them with trembling fingers every night before closing, counting them like a man afraid he'd lost his mind. The wood was old, scarred by decades of spilled drinks and carved initials, but these symbols were different. They seemed to shift in the dim light, rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. His regulars joked about the strange sounds that started after midnight, the footsteps on the second floor when the building was empty, the way glasses moved on their own, the cold spots that appeared without warning. But Alan never laughed along. He knew something they didn't. He'd found a leather journal hidden in the wall during renovations, and what he read inside changed everything. The previous owner hadn't left by choice, and those symbols, they were a warning he discovered far too late. I'm Jason Fox, and what happened at that bar still haunts me. Alan Mercer first told me about the symbols on a February night in 2019. He'd been managing the Iron Bell in Dover, New Hampshire for 8 months, and the weight of whatever he was carrying had carved deep lines around his eyes. The bar sat on a corner lot downtown, a brick building from 1887 that had survived fires, floods, and more owners than anyone could count. Alan wasn't a superstitious guy. He'd spent 20 years in the restaurant business, working his way up from dishwasher to manager, and he'd seen every kind of strange behavior alcohol could produce. But this was different, he insisted. This was real. He slid into his usual spot at the end of my bar around 11 that night, after his own shift ended. His hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around his whiskey glass. The February cold had followed him inside, or maybe it was something else making him shiver. He explained that he'd discovered the symbols 3 weeks earlier during a deep cleaning. The Iron Bell had been purchased by new owners in August, and they'd given Alan free rein to modernize the place. New floors, fresh paint, updated lighting. But when he'd moved the antique bar to refinish the floor beneath it, he'd found 6 symbols carved into the wood on the underside. They weren't random scratches. Each one was deliberate, precise, carved deep enough that whoever made them had spent considerable time on the work. Alan described them as geometric shapes, interconnected in ways that hurt to look at for too long. Circles within triangles, lines that seemed to bend at impossible angles, dots arranged in patterns that almost made sense but didn't quite. He'd taken photos, shown them to a few people, but nobody could identify what they were. One friend suggested they might be hobo signs from the Depression era. Another thought they might be Masonic symbols. But Alan knew better. These marks felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The sound started the same week he discovered them. Footsteps on the second floor, which had been converted to storage years ago. Slow, deliberate steps that paced back and forth between midnight and 3 in the morning. Alan would be alone, finishing paperwork in his office, and he'd hear someone walking above him. The first time it happened, he'd grabbed a baseball bat and gone upstairs, certain someone had broken in. But the storage area was empty. Doors still locked from the inside. Windows secure. Dust lay undisturbed on the floor. No footprints. No signs anyone had been there in weeks. The second event happened 5 days later. Alan arrived at 6 in the morning to accept a delivery and found every glass behind the bar had been moved. Not thrown, not broken, just relocated. Pint glasses stood in perfect rows on tables throughout the bar. Wine glasses hung from light fixtures. Shot glasses formed a circle in the center of the floor. The arrangement was too precise to be random, too deliberate to be the work of drunk vandals. And the alarm system had never been triggered. No doors or windows had been opened. The security footage showed nothing but empty rooms, and then, between frames 3:17 and 3:18 in the morning, all the glasses were suddenly in their new positions. No movement captured, just before and after. Alan's assistant manager, Dustin Walsh, quit the next day. He'd been the one to review the security footage with Alan, and whatever they saw had shaken him badly. Alan told me that Dustin had gone pale, actually stumbled backward, and said he couldn't work there anymore. He didn't explain, didn't ask for his final paycheck, just left and never came back. Alan tried calling him several times but got no response. When he drove to Dustin's apartment, the landlord said he'd moved out overnight, left most of his belongings, and headed south. Georgia maybe, or Florida. Somewhere warm, somewhere far from Dover. That's when Alan found the journal. It was hidden inside the wall behind where the old bar had stood, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a gap between studs. The journal belonged to Richard Hartley, who'd owned the Iron Bell from 1983 to 2003. Most of the entries were mundane business records, inventory notes, complaints about the plumbing, but the final 30 pages told a different story. Richard wrote about finding symbols carved into the building's original support beams in the basement. He'd tried to sand them away, paint over them, even chiseled out sections of wood and replaced them, but the symbols always returned in new locations and new configurations, and with them came the presence. Richard described it as a weight, a pressure that made breathing difficult, cold spots that followed him through the building, sounds that had no source, shadows that moved independently of any light source. He wrote that he'd consulted with priests, paranormal investigators, even a university professor who specialized in occult history. Everyone had different theories. One priest suggested the building stood on cursed ground. An investigator claimed to detect multiple entities. The professor identified the symbols as a form of binding sigil, though he couldn't say what they were meant to bind or release. The journal's final entry was dated September 14, 2003. Richard wrote that he'd had enough. Whatever was in the building had started appearing to him directly, not as a ghost, not as anything with a recognizable form, but as a presence that he could feel watching him. It stood in corners where shadows gathered thickly. It breathed behind him when he was alone. It had started affecting customers too. People would suddenly leave mid-drink, faces pale, insisting they needed to go. Some complained about feeling watched. Others mentioned hearing whispers in the bathroom. Richard had decided to sell the building immediately. He didn't care about the loss. He just needed to leave. The journal ended there mid-sentence as if Richard had been interrupted while writing. Alan spent a week researching Richard Hartley. It wasn't easy. The man had left almost no digital footprint. But Alan eventually tracked down an obituary from 2008. Richard had passed away in a mental health facility in Vermont. The obituary was brief, clinical, mentioned no cause of death, but it noted that he'd been a patient there since November 2003. Just 2 months after his final journal entry, Alan found that unsettling. Not the death itself, but the timing. Whatever Richard had experienced had broken something fundamental inside him. The temperature drops began in mid-February. Specific locations in the Iron Bell would suddenly become freezing, localized cold spots that made breath fog even though the heating system worked perfectly everywhere else. These cold spots moved. Alan would feel one near the bar, turn around to investigate and find it had shifted to the storage room doorway. Customers started mentioning it too. A woman sitting at table 7 shivered and moved to a different seat, complaining about a draft. But there was no draft. No open windows, no gaps in the walls. Just inexplicable cold that came and went without reason. Then the dreams started. Alan would lie in bed at home, miles from the Iron Bell, and dream about the building. But these weren't normal dreams. They were too vivid, too consistent. He'd stand in the empty bar at 3 a.m, and someone would be sitting in the corner booth. Not a ghost, not a transparent figure. Just a person sitting there, facing away, completely still. Alan would walk toward the booth and the figure would stand and turn, but he'd wake up before seeing its face. The dream repeated identically every night for a week. Same time, same booth, same figure that never revealed itself. His girlfriend, Allison Mitchell, noticed the change in him. She told Alan he'd started talking in his sleep, saying things that didn't make sense, names he didn't recognize, phrases in what sounded like different languages. She'd recorded him one night on her phone, and when she played it back, Alan heard his own voice speaking words he'd never learned. The audio file disturbed him so deeply that he deleted it, but Allison had already backed it up to her laptop. She played it for me one night when Alan was working late. The voice was his, unmistakably, but the cadence was wrong, the pronunciation too precise for someone sleep-talking. And the words, when I looked them up later, were fragments of Latin and Old English, phrases used in binding rituals. Something changed in late February. The activity intensified. Alan would arrive at the bar to find furniture rearranged. Tables stacked impossibly high, balanced in ways that defied physics. Chairs hanging from ceiling beams by their legs, no rope or wire visible. The jukebox would play songs that weren't in its catalog, old recordings that sounded like they'd been captured on wax cylinders, scratchy and distant, and the symbols multiplied. Alan found new ones carved into bathroom stalls, etched into the metal of the walk-in cooler, burned into the wooden floor beneath rugs. Always the same geometric patterns, always in sets of 6. The first time Alan saw it directly was March 3rd. He was alone, inventorying liquor after closing. The bar was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. He bent down to count bottles on a low shelf, and when he stood up, someone was standing on the other side of the bar. Not a customer who'd hidden during closing, not an intruder who'd picked the locks. Just suddenly there, as if they'd materialized from nothing. Alan described the figure as wearing clothes from another era, perhaps the 1940s or 50s, but the details were difficult to focus on. The face seemed to shift, features rearranging themselves, never quite settling into a recognizable form. It didn't speak. It just stood there watching him with eyes that might have been empty sockets or might have been too full of something Alan couldn't name. He ran, just bolted for the front door, fumbled with the locks and didn't stop running until he'd reached his car 3 blocks away. His hand shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. When he finally looked back toward the iron bell, he saw lights flickering in the windows. Not the normal lights. These pulsed in patterns, on and off like some kind of code. He drove home, called in sick the next day and seriously considered never going back. But he did go back. Financial necessity, responsibility to the new owners, or maybe something else drew him back. When he arrived, everything appeared normal. The bar was locked, alarm set, no signs of the previous night's encounter. But he found a new journal entry. Not from Richard Hartley. This one was written on a piece of paper, yellowed with age, tucked under the register. The handwriting was old-fashioned, careful. It read, 6 marks to hold 6 doors, 6 doors to keep what must not walk. But the marks fade, and the doors weaken. What watches from the other side grows impatient. You feel it now, don't you? The waiting is almost over. Alan showed me that paper. The ink was brown, faded, and the paper itself was brittle, easily decades old. But it had been placed there recently, he insisted. The night before specifically. He'd locked up with nothing under the register, and now this was there. I held it carefully, studied the handwriting, and felt something cold run down my spine. The paper was old, genuinely old, not artificially aged, and yet it had appeared in a locked building overnight. The theory Alan developed, pieced together from Richard's journal and his own research, was that the iron bell had been built on top of something. Not a burial ground, not an old murder site. Something older. Dover was one of the earliest European settlements in New Hampshire, established in 1623. The land had history before that, indigenous peoples who'd lived there for thousands of years. And sometimes, Alan suggested, places accumulated things. Not just memories, but presences, entities. Maybe they were ghosts. Maybe they were something else entirely, something that didn't fit into comfortable categories. And the iron bell, for whatever reason, served as a kind of barrier. Those 6 symbols weren't decorative. They were functional. A lock. A seal. Something meant to keep the barrier intact. But seals degrade. Wood rots, marks fade, and what was once strong becomes weak. Alan believed that's what was happening. The barrier was failing. Whatever had been kept separate was starting to bleed through. The footsteps, the moved objects, the figure he'd seen, these were signs of increasing permeability between here and somewhere else. The owners didn't believe him. When Alan tried to explain, they laughed, suggested he'd been working too hard, offered him a week off. They brought in a contractor to evaluate the building's structural integrity and found nothing concerning. They hired an electrician to check for wiring issues that might explain the flickering lights. Everything came back normal. From their perspective, Alan was losing it. Stress and imagination combining into delusion. But I believed him. I'd known Alan for 3 years, served him drinks dozens of times, heard hundreds of his stories. He wasn't prone to fantasy, he wasn't dramatic. If anything, he understated things. So when he told me about the iron bell, I listened. Events accelerated in mid-March. Staff members reported feeling hands on their shoulders when nobody was behind them. A bartender named Sophie dropped an entire tray of glasses and quit on the spot, refusing to explain what had frightened her. Customers began leaving negative reviews online mentioning weird vibes and uncomfortable atmosphere. Revenue dropped. The new owners grew concerned, but not about supernatural activity, about their investment. They blamed Alan's management, suggested he wasn't maintaining the bar's reputation properly. They gave him an ultimatum: turn things around in 30 days, or they'd find someone who could. Alan became obsessed. He spent hours researching binding rituals, protective symbols, methods of containment used across different cultures and time periods. He consulted with people he'd found online, practitioners of various traditions who claimed knowledge of such things. Most were charlatans, obviously, people eager to charge money for useless advice. But one woman, an academic at a university in Vermont, took him seriously. She specialized in colonial American folklore and had written papers on protective magic used by early settlers. She explained that binding symbols were common, though their specific forms varied. They were meant to contain or repel, to create boundaries that certain entities couldn't cross. And yes, they degraded over time, especially if they weren't maintained. The academic explained that maintenance typically required renewal of intent. The symbols needed to be recarved, re-blessed, recharged with whatever force had originally empowered them. But that required knowing the original ritual, understanding the specific tradition these marks came from. Without that knowledge, Alan couldn't renew them, and based on what he'd described, the academic estimated the symbols had maybe weeks before they failed completely. What happened then, she couldn't say. But it wouldn't be good. Alan tried anyway. He researched, found what he thought might be appropriate rituals, and performed them after hours. Salt circles, burning sage, recited words in Latin he'd found in old books. He recarved the original 6 symbols, making them deeper, clearer. For 3 days, the activity stopped completely. The bar felt normal. No cold spots, no sounds, no presence. Alan felt hopeful. Maybe he'd actually done something right. Then on the 4th night, everything returned at once. Every glass in the bar shattered simultaneously. Not fell and broke, but exploded from within, sending shards across the floor in patterns that looked almost intentional. The jukebox played all its songs at once, a cacophony of overlapping melodies. Every door in the building slammed repeatedly, bang, 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 though no wind blew. And in the center of the bar, standing perfectly still, was the figure Alan had seen before, except now there were 5 more behind it. 6 figures total, 6 entities, 1 for each symbol, 1 for each door. Alan told me he understood in that moment. The symbols weren't keeping something out, they were keeping things in. 6 entities, bound to the iron bell, held in place by marks that were finally failing. His renovations, moving the bar, disturbing the wood that had damaged the containment, and his attempted renewal had made things worse, weakened the barrier further rather than strengthening it. The entities weren't trying to enter, they were trying to leave, and Alan had accidentally helped them. I didn't see him for a week after that night. He called once, voice ragged, and said he was taking care of it. Wouldn't explain how. Just said he'd found information that might help, a way to reinforce the binding properly. He sounded exhausted, defeated, but determined. When he finally came into my bar again, it was late March. He looked like he'd aged years in weeks. Hollow eyes, gray skin, hands that couldn't stop trembling. He ordered whiskey and drank 3 shots before speaking. He told me what he'd done. He'd found Richard Hartley's original research, notes that weren't in the journal but had been stored elsewhere. A safety deposit box in Richard's name, containing documents about the Iron Bell's history. The building's original owner, a man named Samuel Greystone, had been involved in occult practices. Not harmful ones necessarily, but practices nonetheless. He'd believed that certain locations attracted entities, and that these entities needed to be managed, contained, given boundaries. The symbols weren't punishment, they were agreement. The entities had been offered something, residence perhaps, or acknowledgement, in exchange for limitation. 6 entities, 6 marks, 6 defined spaces. As long as the marks held, the entities remained bound by their agreement. But agreements require maintenance. Samuel Greystone had performed annual rituals to renew the binding, ceremonies on specific dates using specific materials. When he passed away in 1921, the ritual stopped. For decades, the binding held anyway, momentum carrying it forward. But time degrades all things. By Richard Hartley's era, the binding was failing. By Alan's time, it was nearly gone. The entities weren't malevolent exactly. They were just tired of being bound, eager to move beyond their designated spaces. And as the binding weakened, they'd begun testing boundaries, pushing against limitations. Alan had performed the renewal ritual properly this time. He'd followed Samuel Greystone's instructions exactly, down to the specific materials and timing. He'd done it alone on the spring equinox, in the basement where the original binding had been performed. And it had worked. The entities retreated. The activity stopped. The barrier was restored, but Alan paid a price. The ritual required sacrifice. Not blood, not death, but something else. A promise. Alan had agreed to become the new maintainer, the person responsible for performing annual renewals, which meant he was bound to the Iron Bell now, just as the entities were. Couldn't leave Dover, couldn't sell the bar, couldn't walk away. He was tied to that location for the rest of his life, or until he found someone else to take over the responsibility. He told me all this with a strange, calm acceptance of his situation. The Iron Bell was quiet now, profitable, safe, but Alan knew what the silence cost. Every spring equinox, he'd descend to that basement and repeat the ritual, maintaining the agreement, keeping 6 entities contained in their designated spaces. He'd become part of the building's history, another entry in the long chain of people who'd taken responsibility for something most would never believe existed. The last time I saw Alan was in September 2023, 4 years after that first conversation. He looked better, healthier, like he'd made peace with his situation. The Iron Bell was thriving under his management. He'd even started documenting everything properly, creating a new journal like Richard Hartley's, but more complete. Instructions for whoever came after him. A guidebook for maintaining something that shouldn't exist but did. He seemed almost content. He'd found purpose, even if it was purpose he'd never wanted or asked for. But before he left that night, he said something that stuck with me. He mentioned that the entities weren't the only things bound by the symbols. The symbols themselves had power, and power attracts attention. He'd started noticing other marks appearing around Dover, not in the Iron Bell but in other old buildings. Different symbols, different patterns, but similar intent. Like Dover sat on something, a convergence of whatever forces these bindings manipulated. And maybe the Iron Bell wasn't unique. Maybe it was just the one he'd happened to discover. How many other buildings contained similar agreements, similar bindings, similar entities waiting patiently for barriers to fail? I think about that sometimes, late at night when the bar's quiet and I'm alone with closing duties. I look at the walls, the floor, the old wood and brick that make up this place, and I wonder what marks might be hidden beneath the surface. What agreements might have been made before I ever worked here. What presence might be waiting in spaces I can't perceive. Because if Alan's story taught me anything, it's that the world contains layers we don't see, boundaries we don't recognize, and things that exist in the gaps between what we believe is real and what actually is. The Iron Bell still operates in Dover. Alan still manages it. And every spring when the equinox arrives, he goes down to that basement and performs a ritual most people would call impossible. Because sometimes the impossible is just another word for things we don't understand yet. And understanding, Alan learned, doesn't make them any less real. It just makes them manageable. Which might be the best any of us can hope for when dealing with forces older than memory, entities bound by symbols, and places where the barrier between here and somewhere else grows thin enough to feel. So what do you do when you discover your workplace isn't just a building, but a container? When you learn that the ground beneath you holds things that need to be held, and that holding them is now your responsibility. Alan chose to stay, to accept, to become part of something larger than himself. Maybe that was courage. Maybe it was resignation. Or maybe it was just understanding that some things matter more than personal freedom, that maintaining boundaries serves purposes we might never fully grasp. Have you ever felt something watching from the corners of a familiar place? Ever noticed marks that didn't belong, patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental? I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city or state in the comments. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. Have you ever encountered something that defied explanation? Experienced a location that felt fundamentally wrong in ways you couldn't articulate? Share your story in the comments. I read every one, and who knows, maybe your experience will be the next one I share here. If this story got under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I've got plenty more where this came from. See you in the next story if you dare.